Hey everyone, this is Tony Reeves, and I want to have a moment to have a little straight talk with you about a couple of the things people have been bringing to my attention about the topics that I've been talking about with regards to Black Generation X. I want to talk to you about it from a three-part component to it because it's important for you to understand why I'm bringing this to your attention. A lot of times, and let's kind of set this up accordingly. If you stop and you think about it, when we think about various times in our history and how they are treated for all intents and purposes, we have very visual images that come into our mind. Like if we think about the 1914s and the 1920s, usually Prohibition and usually Depression pops into mind. If you segue into the 40s, then you start thinking about World War II. Once you get into the 50s and 60s, you start thinking about all the movements that came in. Civil rights movements, equal rights movements, the peace movement. You also move into the Vietnam War and those particular time periods. So, but also you have to also remember that for someone who's Black during that time period, we're talking about Jim Crow, we're talking about redlining, we're talking about restrictive covenants. We're talking about this particular period of time where a lot of people had the same shared experiences, for lack of better words. But then around 1970, which is usually the dates that you often hear is thrown off, you have this transition where everything starts to lighten up. You get this period of time where around, I think, 75 is when we're coming out of Vietnam. All of your major civil rights legislation, which came in the 60s, have been passed. We're now looking at desegregation, integration, desegregation of schools, things of that nature. All these things tend to manifest themselves. And so what happens is that you now usher in this new generation, which is Generation X, who now get the benefit of everything that their parents went through. That means all of the struggles that their parents, the boomers or the silent generation, the greatest generation, all of the things that great-grandparents, grandparents, and their parents did, they now get the opportunity to enjoy those experiences. Well, what does that mean going forward? Once you get to like 70, if you stop and you think about it, you don't normally see a lot of representation that is what I would call, I'm not going to say negative, but you don't have those power moments like you see when you have those visual images of Vietnam or those visual images of Black civil rights workers getting sprayed with hoses. Those are the things that kind of sear into your mind. But if you stop and you think about my generation, just be honest with yourself. What actually pops up into your mind? A lot of our representation, you'll see the punk movement. You'll see the early rap. You're talking about the gangster rap period. We're talking about New Jack Swing. We're also talking about the MTV era, the BET era. If you really stop and look at our generation, for my generation and so forth, since we're the transition, and we're the ones who literally probably from kindergarten, we're the first generation from kindergarten to 12, went to school in a desegregated environment. When you look at it from that standpoint, it would be easy for people to see and make an assumption that, oh my gosh, it all worked out. And here's where it's important to understand why we need to share these stories. So as a member of Black Generation X, we were the ones where literally we came in during a time period where the people who had very clear-cut views about race, and there was a very clear-cut culture about race, changed overnight. So remember, this is some of the things that we often lose sight of. Keep in mind, when you look going backwards, not only was there a prominent culture of racism in terms of the culture, but there was also institutional controls with relating to that. That means it was a part of the laws in a lot of instances. If you go up north, there were restrictive covenants where you couldn't sell a house to a Black family. You had situations where people couldn't use the GI Bill if they were Black. When you came down south, we're talking about various laws with regards to where you sat, where you ate, where you stayed. So you had the things relating to race that was embedded within the institutions and embedded within the laws themselves, and you had the cultures. So now that you've eliminated the institutions, you still have the culture. That culture didn't go away. And so all of a sudden, you now have this new situation where Generation X has to move in a space where the institutions are no longer discriminatory, but there are still a lot of people who have attitudes about people of color who are here. And you know who have to basically navigate that? The kids, us. And so the reason why I share this is because for a couple of very powerful reasons. One is because when you look at how our generation is often represented, you'll see Club MTV, you'll see BET, you'll see 106 and Park, you'll see all of these various representations where you see a diverse group of kids and a diverse group of young people, and we're all getting together and we're having a great old time. But the reality is that when you're looking at that collectively, it doesn't show you the darker points. It doesn't show you the times when things weren't as warm and fuzzy. But what it does is that it gives this image that we've now turned the corner. And here's the other part of it as well. Because remember, if you're talking the 60s going back, it was the norm that people of color would be treated a certain way. And if they weren't treated that way, that was the exception. Now we flip the script. So now it's the norm that they're not treated that way. And there is this narrative that's being pushed that if anybody treats you differently, that's the exception. Well, unfortunately, if you look at how we are depicted during that time period, it's easy to draw that. So it's important, and I make it a good point that I want to encourage people, share stories where you knew what it was like growing up at this time period, where it was not always cut and dry. Which brings me to a very interesting point, because a lot of times what happens is you'll get people, and I've had quite a few comments where I've had people who've said to me, why are you bringing up this, man? Why are you dredging all this up and so forth? This didn't happen like this to everybody. So why are you bringing up the past? That's why we can't go anywhere as a people. And this is where I have to pause and say, keep in mind, that was the other aspect of what it meant to grow up in Generation X. We didn't have the same shared experience. We didn't. So as a result, I often have to tell people, listen, don't take this the wrong way. Just because you didn't have this experience doesn't mean that my experience is less important. And just because I had the experience doesn't mean your perspective is less important. In other words, if I'm telling you I grew up in a time period where I moved in spaces where there have been sometimes people have been hostile towards me, moving in the South, and you grew up in the South and you didn't have that experience, it's really not your place to come to tell me that I'm basically holding everybody back by bringing up something that you never experienced. And so I have to sometimes remind people that here's the thing that's important to realize. We did not all have the same shared experiences, but we did have some experiences. I will never tell people, if you're a minority or if you're a black person and you went to a predominantly white institution for college, that your experiences were going to be just like mine. But in the same instance, I wouldn't expect you to do that to me either. But that's kind of the reality of where we're at. And so it's important because when we start going down this path of telling each other that we should stop sharing stories or stop sharing experiences because not all of us went through it, here's the danger that you run across. What you do is whether you know it or not, you selectively decide what parts of history are important to know. And if you do that, you create a narrative. And even if you don't, that's not what you're trying to do. So I often tell people that, listen, if you're going to tell the story, you have to tell the whole story, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And part of the ugly part is recognizing that, hey, we need to hear all of your experiences because collectively, those are the lessons that future generations can learn. So it's important that you not try to tell people to not share stories because they're bringing back the past and they're dredging up stuff, or more importantly, trying to tell you that what you went through was not as bad as you say it was. Because this is what I've told people this before. Listen, I'm telling you what I went through. And respectfully, you weren't there. So to effectively get in my face and say, oh, it wasn't that bad. And see, people like you bringing up stuff, and I keep thinking to myself, here's the damage that you're saying. Because you're not telling me to be honest. Because if you're thinking I'm lying, I'll tell you I'm being honest. What you're doing is, whether you want to believe it or not, is you're trying to shame me into not saying that. So in that sense, I tell people all the time, the joy of conversation and interactions is that if you don't like what you hear, walk away. But to basically use your voice to impart upon someone that they should not share their story because you believe it is contrary to your own experience or contrary to where you think we should go, there's a danger there. Because here's the danger. In order for us to know how to get where we need to go, it is important that we know where the pitfalls are along the way. So this is why I am a staunch believer that share those stories. Let people know what you went through. Generation X is a transitional generation because if you look at our generation, and just be honest, if you come to somebody and they say to you, like somebody says to me, as if I look at the baby boomer generation, named for me any significant moments of history relating to race, I could rattle off a bunch of them, whether it be Martin Luther King's assassination, Martin Luther King's whether it be Martin Luther King's assassination, Malcolm X's assassination, Medgar Evers, whether it be the Little Rock Central 9, whether it be Rupert Bridges, I can just roll the things off my lips. When you come to Generation X, you have to pause and stop and think about it for a second and say, what happened during our time? For me, if I'm being completely honest, probably the two things that may be what I would consider substantive that most people would relate to if I brought it to their attention would be Rodney King, which I believe was around 92. I may be wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong. And then there was O.J. Simpson, which I believe was around 95. Again, the dates may be off. But the reality is that I can tell you that when I was growing up and going to graduate school and undergrad between 87 and 95, there were a lot of police involved shootings that resulted in riots in various areas that I'm familiar with. But we don't often talk about those things. So why am I stressing this to those of you out there? It's important that we capture all these stories. It really is. So I thank all the people who provide comments, good, bad, ugly, positive, not positive, whatever the case may be. If you feel some kind of way, I appreciate it because whether you know it or not, I read everything you post. I learn from it, I take from it, and I move forward in a way that I hope will be beneficial to the next person. But it's important that you remember, for our generation, if you're a member of Black Generation X, we are considered the transition generation because, as I've said, we were the ones where everything was laid out. We literally rolled in with the protections of Roe v. Wade, the protections of Brown v. Board, the protections of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Rights Act. All of these things were rolled out to our benefit, and we moved in a desegregated environment where we didn't have to experience the hostility that Jim Crow had. So it's important, and I cannot stress this enough, as we're going forward, keep sharing those stories because I want to make sure people know that our generation was just more than just a footnote in history. All the things that happened, we had to go through the growing pains of what those things meant. And I hope that you learn from those as well.